Welcome to This Week in Electro, and in this episode I want to talk about maths. In particular, why maths is important to us as electricians and why it's important, well, really in life, I guess. I've been reading recently about the declining number of students who are either taking a high level of maths in their final years of school or even taking maths at all. And not only that, but I myself have even noticed in the past few years when I've had students come through, even their level of maths seems to be getting less and less and less. And this is a big problem because maths forms the fundamentals of electrotechnology. So if you want to work in this industry, you really need to have a solid understanding of how maths works. Now, why are more and more students less inclined to take it? Well, in my opinion, there's actually a few reasons why this I think is happening. And the first is, let's just get the obvious one out of the way with. The first is maths is not exactly the most exciting subject in the world. You may enjoy it, and if you do, great, excellent. But many people don't. And to be completely honest, turning up at a party somewhere and saying, hey, you know what I did today? I managed to find the obtuse angle on a quadrahedral on the x-axis minus the sum of infinity. That really doesn't sound as good as saying, hey, check out my new Ferrari. So it's not a very exciting topic. And I remember when I was back at school, I never really found it that interesting either. In fact, I was quite good at math, even from a very, very early age, but I found it boring, so I never really tried. And in some respects, that kind of went against me towards my senior years. Because I just didn't put the effort in, I remember sitting my final exams and starting to really realize that, man, I should know this stuff. I can do it, but I haven't put the effort in to really remember it well and do it well. Now, at that point in time, although that was a realization for me, when I then started my trade as an electrician, it then really became obvious how important that maths actually was. So I remember sitting in TAFE class or technical college, and we were doing some mathematical equations and realizing that I actually could do these quite well because I knew various shortcuts. I had learned a more advanced version of maths than what was being taught. Because if I go back a bit, when I was in my final year, I was doing what was called, or what is now called, maths standard. The next level was maths extension, and then there's one level above that. And I was basically doing standard, which was, a decent level of maths. There was a couple of levels below that as well. So I'm sitting at TAFE and realizing I actually knew shortcuts and I knew mathematical ways of doing some of this work, which was going to save me a lot of time. And there was another guy in my class who was also like me. We had finished our last year at high school, where back then most students didn't finish their last year at high school and go to an apprenticeship. They would leave 2 years before the end of high school. So by doing this math, suddenly found it much, much easier. And other people in the class were really, really struggling because they just didn't have that level. Now, going on from that, after finishing my trade and working in the industry, I find I'm using maths all the time. And it's not the complicated stuff all the time. There are times when I will use complicated maths, but realistically, it is real basic stuff that you should be able to do in your head. For example, when you are working out how much somebody needs to pay you for a job, how much expenditure you've had on a particular job, how much things cost, how much percentage on top are you going to put on to make the money so that you can have a decent lifestyle and run your business. All of these things require basic maths. When you're running cabling and you have to figure out what size cabling I need to use, how much current is going to get drawn through a cable, how much voltage, all of these things that we deal with as electricians, you have to calculate it out and figure out, okay, you know, what size cabling, what type of cabling I'm going to use, and this is all done by maths. So maths is actually very, very important. And this is not just for the electrical trade. I mean, if you do any trade, you'll find the same thing. So, you know, if you go into carpentry, well, you need to know how much timber you need to buy to build a house, for example. If you go into plumbing, you need to know what is the pressure of the water or the gas that you're dealing with in those pipes. How can those pipes sustain that pressure? And you need to, again, calculate that out. So there are many times when you find that you will use maths in your actual real life when you've left high school that, to be honest, I think a lot of students don't really appreciate until they leave, until it dawns on them, oh, I actually have to know this stuff. And you're really putting yourself, and I think students are really putting themselves at a huge, huge disadvantage by taking the attitude of, well, I don't need it. When am I ever going to use this in my life? And then not applying themselves when they have the opportunity to learn it correctly. Because when you leave school, you don't have that opportunity anymore. So I think that's one of the problems. I think another problem which ties into all this is why a lot of students aren't taking a higher level of maths is really because, I don't want to say the way it's taught because that's probably incorrect, but it's very much they don't see that connection. So this connection I'm talking about right now, about figuring out how much I need to get paid, how much equipment I need to buy, etc., etc. These connections aren't really made. I mean, when you're sitting there looking at a number plane or you're sitting there plotting points on a graph, you know, you don't see that connection that, hey, you know what, I'm going to actually need this to figure out how I'm going to get paid. You know, when you're creating graphs, you know, when you're running a business, you're creating graphs all the time because you want to see how much time you've worked on certain jobs. You want to see, you know, where things are coming from, whatever. You have graphs that you do this with. So a lot of these connections I don't think are made back in the classroom. And, you know, that's for various reasons. Maybe the teacher teaching it doesn't have that extra outside experience to be able to bring that in. Maybe the students do not understand because they haven't been in a situation, maybe they haven't seen, you know, their parents or their relatives in a situation where they've had to use this sort of maths. So there's various reasons why this may be the case, but I seriously think that there is this disconnection with understanding where it's going to be used in the real world. And when you're teaching any subject, especially in high school, you are generally teaching an overview anyway. So especially in something like maths, where you may be teaching, you know, a quadratic equation. And if you're going to go and work for, you know, a timber yard, you're probably never going to use the quadratic equation. But geometry, surface area, all that sort of stuff, that you are going to use that if you're working in a timber yard. But you may not use that, you know, if you're doing something maybe in a laboratory at university. So you have to keep these things in mind. There are going to be different areas of the subject, and this goes for all subjects, not just maths, but there will be different areas in the subject that will pertain to different areas of life. And this, I think, is a problem because students don't see that connection a lot of times, or they don't see the overview. So I think that's a problem. There's also the issue where a lot of the systems that we have set up for students to go into pathways, whether it be into jobs or whether into university or technical college or whatever, a lot of those systems are set up where maths doesn't seem to be a big requirement. So they think, well, you know, do I really want to try and do something and risk not getting good marks because I might find it difficult, where I could choose some other subjects that are going to make life a little bit easier and maybe I can, you know, gives me an easier path. And the reality is the easy path is not the right path. It never is, because you will still make mistakes along the way. And generally what happens when people try taking that easier path, they actually take the wrong path for them, and they find out later on that actually whatever they decide to do, whether it be university or a job, they actually don't like it. And because they just did it because it was easy, and they find out that that's not the case. Or alternatively, they find out that it's actually harder than what they thought. They thought it was going to be easy, and then turns out later on down the track it's actually much, much harder. And if they just applied themselves and tried a little bit harder and trying something a little bit more advanced and challenge themselves earlier on, life gets easier later on. So I guess it's kind of like, in some ways, it's kind of like playing an instrument. You see these people up in bands and musicians in general, and and you think, wow, they're great, they're awesome. But they only got there by challenging themselves. There was no way they were ever going to get there by taking an easy route and think, oh, well, I'll just do it this way. That just doesn't happen. The people that get to the level that you might idolize got there through hard work, challenging themselves, and really, really pushing. So if we take this back to the whole concept of maths, again, maths underpins everything. It underpins the universe. And myself, for example, I didn't really like it when I was back at school. So since I left school, I actually realized how important that was. So that's basically a bit of a rant about why maths is important, and you should be studying it, and you should be trying very hard if you're still in school doing that. And if you're not in school, if you've finished and you're watching this video, and you're wanting to go into a trade, definitely, then start brushing up on your maths. It's going to be very, very important to you. So that's it for this episode of This Week in Electro. I hope you've got something from that. I hope you've learned something from that. If so, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.